So, in this context, a right is a moral claim or a just claim. In other words, a right is that to which one is morally entitled. Now, notice that this presupposes a theory of morality. And incidentally, this is why I'm not a libertarian. Libertarians start at the point of rights, they start with self ownership, assuming that one has a right to one's body. But they don't have a theory of morality to justify this claim. So, what is morality? Morality refers to a code of values adopted by choice to guide human behavior. So, do human beings need a code of morality? What are values? And are values factual, or are they just a matter of preference? For our purposes, there are two definitions of value, two senses in which we must use the term. The first definition is that which one seeks to gain and or keep. The second is any object or quality desirable as a means or end in itself. The first, as applies to humans, merely indicates what someone happens to value and is entirely subjective. The second, however, indicates what is desirable, what is worth seeking. This indicates what has value and is entirely factual, not a matter of opinion. Now, how do we arrive at these definitions? We do so by applying reason to our observations. We observe that certain entities, such as tables, chairs, and rocks, can neither act nor do they have to act to sustain themselves. Their existence is a matter of fact. They can do nothing to affect it. Other entities, however, such as worms, birds, lions, and humans, can and must act in order to sustain themselves. The difference, obvious to everyone, is between non living entities and living entities. So, when we observe living entities acting, we notice that some things, such as food, water, are good for them, while other things, like poison and predators, are obviously bad for them. They harm them. In other words, some things are of value to them. Hold on. While others are a disvalue. It is only for a living entity that something can be of value, that something can be worth seeking. We judge the value of a thing by whether it is good or bad for the life of an organism. Life is the standard of value. Now, most living entities act automatically on instinct. Humans, however, operate by choice. We have free will. Furthermore, we don't know automatically what's good or bad for us. We have to learn it. And with humans, there's also the possibility for a dichotomy between what we value and what has value, between what we seek and what is good for us. For instance, we have heroin addicts, alcoholics, gambling addicts, overeaters, people that engage in all types of behaviors that are not good for them. So not only do humans have to learn what is good for them, but we have to choose to pursue the good. This is what gives rise to the subject of morality and explains why humans need it. Furthermore, given the length of human life and the conceptual nature of human consciousness, we must codify the values that we're going to pursue, that are going to further our lives. Otherwise, we can undermine tomorrow's survival or 20 years survival 20 years from now survival with the actions that we take today. In other words, today's actions can undermine our long-term interest. Humans need to choose to live by a code of values. A code of values adopted by choice is, as we have seen, a code of morality. So to summarize the view of morality anyway, life gives rise to value in both senses in which I have defined the term. An organism's life determines what is of value to it. In other words, life is the standard of value. As morality refers to a code of values adopted by choice, it is only to humans that morality applies. As each organism's life is its standard of value and moral values apply only to humans, human life is the standard of moral value. Now, to return to the subjects of rights. Given that human life is the standard of moral value, and given that people have to choose to be moral, to act in furtherance of their lives, they must have the right to take those actions they judge to further it, so long as they respect the equal rights of everyone else. That's because we cannot have contradictions. I cannot claim rights for myself, but deny them to Sarah or JimBob. So, in other words, how can people not have a moral claim, a moral entitlement, a right to that which makes morality both necessary and possible. Now, if someone acts in violations of a person's rights, that person has the right to use force to stop the violation. And that gets to the crux of it. In practice, rights define when force is appropriate. They demonstrate that self-defense is a moral act. Now, note, my task here was to demonstrate that that rights are factual, and that's the task going forward. It's not to elucidate all the implications of rights, nor to describe the societal conditions necessary for rights to be protected, or to describe the governmental systems that are necessary to do so. I also don't have to lay out a complete system of morality, including the values and virtues it entails. To make my case, all I have to demonstrate is that morality is factual. Now, to anticipate some possible objections to my theory. My opponent may argue that this isn't how people normally think of morality, but my manner of discussing morality dates back to ancient China and ancient Greece. It's completely in the realm of what morality is. So I think that that objection will miss the mark. He may assert that morality has to be dictated by an external entity, such as God, but that assumes the very thing, or at least one of the very things that's in question. He may say that rights don't exist. After all, we don't see them, we can't touch them, we can't point to them. But rights are a relational concept. They explain something that occurs when human beings live amongst each other. Similarly, friendship, couples, enemies, all these things are relational concepts. We cannot see them, we cannot touch them, but they nevertheless exist. Now, another objection may be is my opponent may assert what he believes to be the logical conclusion or a logical conclusion and implication of my theory of rights. And this will likely be something that's detestable to most people. And thus, what he'll try to do is to negate the validity of my argument by pointing to a conclusion that people find unacceptable. But that's not how we do things. We don't assess arguments by assuming a conclusion. We assess conclusions by the strength of the argument. And with that, I will turn it over. I'll give up the rest of my time and thank you both once again.
Thank you, Michael. Jim Bob to you.
Okay, yeah. So the topic of the debate is where do rights come from? In the opener, I heard more opinions about what he thinks morality is. It's actually the case that even if he produces a proof for rights existing, it wouldn't follow that we ought to follow them just definitionally because they exist. So you could focus on both, of course. Now, in some of the opener there, he said the theory of morality. He then went to value, seeking and gaining, desirable. He did not make a distinction between one human who values one thing, they desire, let's say, to live peaceful, and another group of people who desire conflict and terrestrial gain and warfare. Both we've seen in the story of humanity. Michael didn't make a distinction of which values we ought to follow. He merely defined what a value is for people, which is seeking and gaining. Obviously, there's a disparity between people and what they desire. He said he reasons through observation that rights exist or that morality exists. He mentioned lions. He said that being a predator, he said having predators is not good for them. Well, being a predator is actually good for predators. So one could even argue that having predators is actually good for the prey. They build up defenses. They learn how to respond to the natural world. This would include human beings as well. There are predators who are human beings. There are human beings who are prey to other human beings. There are human beings who are prey to other animals that aren't human beings. This still doesn't tell us where rights come from. This still doesn't tell us why we ought to even acknowledge rights as some sort of moral position at all. He also mentioned furthering their life, so long as. Now he slipped in this conditional, which is unjustified. He said, "Yo, do what you want, further your life, so long as you don't violate the thing in question that you didn't produce a justification for, which is rights." He also said morality. He made a basically tried to make a deduction that said morality, or without rights, morality wouldn't be really possible from that position. That's actually not true. Rights are, in fact, fairly a recent innovation. And there have been historical accounts of civilizations that had a sense of deontology or duties without this notion of entitlements. In fact, it was more based on what your duty was in society. That's what gave you what you can and can't do, what you should and shouldn't do, a sense of duties. So society with duties could actually flourish without even appealing to or inventing the concept of rights, which is fairly modern, and I would argue more strictly an enlightenment fixture. um, the other part here is this idea that rights just exist. You reason them from looking. Well, rights don't exist in all places. So how do you look at nature or reality and determine that rights exist? For instance, how do you demonstrate rights exist in a place that doesn't acknowledge them? Do you have the right to invade a country that rejects the existence of rights? Do you have a right to do that? Um, Without a state, let's say, on what basis? Sorry, you're not a libertarian. I would argue, I would restate what a right is. He did say, I think he can correct me if I remember correctly. He does acknowledge that they're kind of an entitlement. You're entitled to something. The problem with this is, to be more strict about what a right actually is a set of permissions and restrictions on behavior that are set by a collective of men with guns. That's all a
Absolutely.
right is. Anything you point to that's a right, that you think is a right, is merely a temporary set of behaviors you're either allowed to do or not allowed to do, that's completely governed and met with force by a collection of men, right? You don't get to choose ultimately sometimes what these permissions are and aren't. You're lucky if you get some sort of pathway to influence what these permissions are. Can I do this? Can I do this? No, I can't. Okay, I don't have a right to do that. The question of animals. Notice that he did make the distinction between animals and humans. He didn't though give an ontological distinction between animals and humans, such that humans have this concept of rights, or that we ought to acknowledge rights, or somehow they're present for humans but not present for lions. There's no distinction. He merely described animals as being subject more or less to their own instincts and involuntary responses to stimuli. And then he grants himself this higher position of humanity, as if we've escaped the animal kingdom at some metaphysical level. He did not provide a metaphysical account for what distinguishes a human being from all other animals. I assume he's going to say reason itself. However, reason itself still doesn't give you a moral position. Why ought we not do X? Why ought we value rights? Regardless, the question of morality is still largely irrelevant. It's parallel. It could be a secondary argument. But the question of how do you demonstrate rights exist in any meaningful way? That's what I want to hear first. The next argument is, why ought we value or acknowledge these rights? If it's the case that you can't demonstrate rights exist, then the topic of the debate of where do rights come from is a failed debate, because you have to demonstrate where rights come from. What is the ontology of rights? It seems to me that Michael is reasoning that rights exist because he prefers a system where you pretend rights exist. That doesn't tell us where rights come from. If he's saying that rights are merely a construction, a conceptual invention by humans that aren't actual, but we should actually live as if they are actual, then he's basically conceded the debate that rights don't come from anywhere. They're just fictional, imaginary things that we probably should use the coercive methods to uphold and defend. With that said, I would love for Michael to continue and maybe give us an account of how he gets rights from reasoning. Where do you produce rights from reasoning?
Okay.
Thank you. Oh, hold on just a second. Thank you, gentlemen, for the opening statements and a kind reminder. We're going to do it slightly different tonight, only because we are on a time constraint to accommodate. So we will go for about another hour and 15 minutes or so. And then we will read and respond. We'll do closing statements. We will read and respond to just a few super chats. I'm going to choose just 20 and up this evening, only for purposes of time's sake. We'll get through anything under that a little later into open panel. And then we will open the panel up and we'll have some fun and go from there. Gentlemen, the floor is open.
Okay, so first, he said that this is not a debate about morality, it's a debate about rights. The problem is, right is a moral concept, it means a moral claim to something. Now, he made the claim that uh, rights are a list of permissions that have to be granted by an entity. The problem is, my definition of rights, and I can provide it later on my X page, comes from numerous dictionaries, comes from artificial intelligence, Grok, as well as Google. It comes from Samuel Johnson's dictionary from 1755. It's in philosophical dictionaries. A right, in the context we're talking about, it's a moral or just claim. So, in order to show that human beings have rights, you have to first have a moral theory, which is why I did that. I nowhere said, as he said, that in order to have morality, you have to have rights. No, it's exactly the opposite. You have to have morality in order to have rights.
Okay,
So
Michael,
hold on one
it's a lot.
second.
That's a lot. That's a lot right
Well,
there.
you said a lot, so I have to
I,
address everything
well,
that you said.
I want to start with at least one thing. Can
Okay.
is the only definition you're using for rights is just a moral claim to something?
A right is a moral or a just claim. Yes,
Okay,
that's
okay, great. How do you determine something's just?
well, how do you determine, because justice also is a moral concept. So
That's
you have
circular.
no, it's not. You have to go back to morality. You have to have a
Okay,
theory of morality.
so rights are a moral claim that's just, and I ask you what's just, and you say that which is moral.
That's not what I said. I said a right is a moral claim or a just claim, but it ultimately traces back to morality. I didn't say a moral claim is a just claim. I said a right is a moral claim. Now, also, he said that I only defined value in terms of that which you seek to gain or keep. That's false. I'd also define value. I started off by saying it would be in two ways. The second way was any object or quality desirable as a means or end in itself. And I said life gives rise to that concept. Why? Because living entities have to act to sustain themselves. Some things harm them, some things are beneficial to them. In the latter case, you have things that are of value to them. There's things that are of value to living organisms. In other words, there's things that are desirable, there's things that are worth
Hold on a second.
seeking.
Hold on a
Let,
second.
let 'em-
Can you give a living organism example? Let's say a bat.
Sure.
Are you claiming that you're making the claim that a bat actually values things?
No, that's not what I said at all.
Okay. You said
And
living
that's
organism. Organism.
Yeah, I never said, you're talking about value in the case of a person that values something.
Mhm.
The definition of value as desirable or worth seeking is entirely factual. It has nothing to do with the bat's consciousness or the lion's consciousness. There are nevertheless things that are of value to them. You're using value in a
Okay, hold on
different
a
sense
second.
because there's
Hold on a
multiple
second.
senses it can be used.
Desire is a thought about a thought. How do you distinguish for an animal um, the difference between an
Mm.
instinct that's an automatic response to stimuli and
Well,
a desire?
actually, what I said was it's desirable, and desirable means worth seeking. So the animal doesn't actually have to want anything. The point in the discussion is that it's going to seek things out, and there are things that are good for it. There's things that will sustain its life. That is what has value.
Okay, so the question of what is a right, the only definition I got was a moral claim to something, to X. A moral claim, right? It's just a
Yeah.
moral claim, right? So if
Right.
I say I have a moral claim to the neighboring country to take its
Okay.
resources, I have a moral claim. How
Sure.
do you distinguish from your concept of rights whether or not I have a right to that as a moral claim?
Okay, well, that is why you need a theory of morality. Now, notice that in the theory of morality, all we stated was that life is the standard of value and that a code of values adopted by choice is a moral code, right? So we're not arguing about the actual implications of rights or what is a right or what's not a right. All I'm arguing right now is that rights actually exist, that
That's
they're
a
not a
question of
matter of
what a right
opinion.
is, though,
Yeah, no,
right?
no, hold on, hold on. What I'm saying is, I told you that a right is that I stated the fundamental right that a person has to have, is entitled to act in ways that that person judges to be moral. But because of the law of contradiction, because you can't just say, well, I can do, whatever I want, he cannot deny others the same right. Now, you might say, well, there's implications of this further down the line, and we can get into that if you want. But for the present discussion, all I have to demonstrate is that there is a factual morality, and that flows from that are moral claims. Once you have morality, the
Okay.
morality that I'm talking about, you have moral claims.
I understand, but you neither have morality and you neither have the thing called a right, because if you're just defining a right to mean a moral claim, you're
Yep.
basically begging the question for what the moral system is. I agree that if you say we ought to value rights, we
Hmm.
ought to be consistent, which is a larger claim you're making. We ought to be consistent and avoid contradictions, which that alone isn't justified from your view.
Okay. Well,
So I would
hold
ask
on.
you a
Hold on.
question.
No, 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 no,
Wait,
no, no, no,
dude,
no, no.
you just went for a
I'm
long time. Let me just get through it, okay?
yeah.
So I'll ask you a more pointed question that
Sure.
you can't really evade the same way. Okay.
I didn't evade
Do,
anything. That's the
do, I,
first thing. I
do
didn't
I have
evade
the
anything.
do I have the right to invade a country that doesn't acknowledge rights?
Okay. The question is irrelevant to the topic at hand.
Okay, all right.
Entirely
How did I know you
irrelevant.
dodge that?
It's not a dodge. It's
I
because
would
it's
I would
irrelevant.
I'm gonna say that I would be agreeable that it actually is, because if the topic is whether rights, where do rights come from, and we're
Yeah.
discussing from one country to another, if it doesn't exist in one country but it exists in
Hold on.
another,
No, no,
why
no,
is
no, 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 no,
why
no,
is that?
no,
So I am
no.
agreeable that it is on topic.
No, no. Here's the problem. You have to first establish that rights exist, and then you can see the problem, Sarah, is you're thinking of rights in terms of different governments in different states. What I am talking about is individual rights, the individual's right to do certain things. Now, that implies that individuals obviously can form together and do certain things. But the point is first to establish right. Now, he says I didn't point to a moral theory. The fact of the matter is, I absolutely did. I defined morality. It's a code of values adopted by choice
That's
to
not a
guide human
grounding. That's not
behaviors.
a foundation, dude.
Hold on. Well, it
That's a
absolutely is.
definition. That's a
It is.
definition.
Yeah, it's a
That's not a
definition.
grounding. That's not a
Hold on.
system.
Hold on. It's a definition derived from observation of how people behave, or how anything behaves. And then you said, furthermore, I just wanted to touch on this first. You said that I didn't differentiate between humans and animals, but I actually did, because I said that humans operate on instinct while humans have free will. And that's what gives rise to the science of morality.
Okay, so I
Morality,
under
morality is just the
dude,
name that we've given.
Michael, even if I
Yeah,
granted you free will for the human, right? It
sure.
doesn't follow that because humans have free will that they ought not um violate other free will. You have to tell me from your system
I didn't
why
say it didn't.
ought why ought a human not violate another human's free will?
Okay. So now, to do that, we're going to really have to dive into ethics. Are we prepared to do that and switch the topic from rights to ethics?
I'm trying. This is the problem. Is like I would define a right as just a set of entitlements people are given in certain countries by their government.
Yeah,
You
but
have the
that's not
right
the
to.
definition of rights. You
Yeah,
can make up whatever you want,
I'm
but that's
giving an
not how rights
example. No, no, I'm
defined.
giving an example, Michael. You failed to give an example. You merely said, when I asked, what is a right? You said a moral claim. And I said, well, what's a moral claim? And you said, a claim that's morally just. And I
No,
go,
no, no,
what's
no.
just? And
That's
you said,
not what I
what's
said.
moral?
You're misrepresenting what I said
Give me
over
an
and over
example
again.
of something that's a right.
I At the very beginning in my opening statement, right? I said that life is the standard of value. Human life is the standard of moral value, and I explained why human life is a standard of
Why
moral
is
value.
human life valuable?
I said it's the standard of value.
Why you're assuming it's valuable? Why is it
No,
valuable?
no, I'm not actually. What I'm saying to you is that that all life, any living entity, the way that you judge of what is of value to it is what is good or bad for it. Once you have a living entity, you have an entity that acts. You have things that are good for it. You have things that are bad for it. This applies to any living entity across the board, any single one.
That's not a moral claim.
No, I didn't.
That's
Hold on. I
a
didn't say
pragmatic
it
claim,
was. No,
right?
no, 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 no.
What do
Jim
you
Bob,
mean
I
good?
didn't say that
Okay,
was moral.
I know.
You're
I'm
Gentlemen,
just
misrepresenting
I
me.
think I just want to make sure I'm understanding both of you the same way. Michael, I believe you're coming from a more individual approach, right? The human right is as an individual, um, as is, right? And then
Sure.
Jim Bob, you're viewing it from the standpoint of what is given to us in terms of like what our government allows or our societal culture norms, so on and so forth, correct?
I'm basically asking him a very pointed question, right? If what's good for a lion is to be a predator, if
Mhm.
it's good for a human based on their subjective goals to be a predator, why is that morally wrong given that your standard is what's good for the organism?
Because this is a different question. You first asserted that I'm saying that animals acting is a moral question, which it's not. Morality only comes into play once you have choice, once you can choose things. That's where morality comes into play. Now, you said to me just now, well, what if somebody values this? Well, so people can value all kinds of things. That's why in my opening statement, I said there can arise a dichotomy in human behavior between what they value and what has value. And I gave several examples. For instance, there was a time in my life when I was an alcoholic and a drug addict. I valued getting stoned, I valued getting drunk. Obviously, those things were harmful to me. So you had a dichotomy between what I valued and what was of value to me. So if you say you have a human being, what if he values being a predator? Well, what if he does? It still remains to be seen and argued whether or not being a predator is actually in that human being's best interest, if it actually furthers his life. And also in my opening statement, I said that being given the nature of human consciousness, which is conceptual, we have to think in principle. And I said, given the nature of the length of life, that humans have to act long term. So, therefore, you'd have to show in a given case what is actually in the interest, what is actually going to further that human being's life.
Is it possible that the best thing for a particular society is to not acknowledge rights?
No.
How tell me how that's the case
Well,
definitionally.
hold on. The problem with your question again is you're already jumping to a political organization and you're saying we have a society. What I'm arguing is that rights form the basis of just society. You first have to establish rights. Now, if you're asking me, this is a broad question you're asking about whether or not a society can flourish if it doesn't respect rights. And for that, I'll just point to Maoist China, Stalinist Russia, Nazi Germany, fascist Italy. I mean, we can go on and on and on with the countries that didn't respect rights and see how they panned out. But that doesn't have anything to do with the factual nature of rights.
So you're saying you're arguing because the whole purpose of the debate is for you to demonstrate to me and the audience that rights actually emerge from reason. But if it's the
No,
case,
no, 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 no. I've never said that.
you said
You
that
keep saying that. I
where do
never
rights
said
come
that.
from?
Rights stem from the nature of human beings and the fact that they live amongst other human beings. The
Doesn't
nature of human beings as moral entities
that
is
doesn't
what
tell me where rights come from.
I just told you.
You're just
Hold on.
saying that, dude.
Go-
It did
Are you going to keep
hold on.
interrupting or are you going
Hold on.
to ask a
No, no,
question and let
dude,
me answer?
you're making one claim at a time,
Hold
okay? It's
on.
fair for me to combat one claim at a time. Isn't it the
Okay.
case that
Mm,
civilizations existed before the concept of rights?
sure.
Okay, so there you have civilizations sustaining
Sure.
themselves for whatever amount of time without assuming rights. So maybe civilizations had a set of obligations and duties and they didn't have this concept of rights, okay?
Hold on.
So if
Hold
that's the
on.
case, I'm asking you a very pointed question. How do you distinguish what's missing in one society that doesn't acknowledge rights and one that does? If you're going to say rights are produced in one and the other, is it just agreement?
Hold on. I'm not saying that I've never said rights are produced in one or the other. My claim from the start is that rights are factual. I explained why in my opening statement. You can laugh and you can, pander to the
Give
audience
me
and do
one
whatever you'd
right that's
like.
factual.
The right of a human being to act in furtherance of his own existence. Factual.
Wait, they have the right to do that. Okay.
Yes.
Can I take that right with force?
hold on. You're switching the
It's
question.
over. It's
No,
toast.
no, no, no. You can
And answer
violate
the
that.
question.
You can
Can I answer?
violate that right with
Dude,
force. You
just
can violate
that's
right with
question
force.
begging.
The entire reason we argue for rights is to convince people. Obviously, if you have guns, you can violate somebody's right, JimBob. That's
No,
an
rights come from
obvious
people with
claim.
guns, set of
No,
permissions.
no,
Yes.
no,
Yes.
no. Rights can be violated by people with guns. Of course, the whole idea, what we want to accomplish, is to subordinate might to right, to put might on the side of individual rights, to protect individual rights. If nobody could violate rights, there'd be no need to have the
Okay,
concept.
look,
The
the
whole
question
reason we have the concept is because people can violate rights.
look, I just gave an example. Like you said, right, that people just for merely existing as an organism with choice, they have rights. And I said, isn't it possible for someone to just take away that choice?
Well, hold on. I'm a human being with a hand. Somebody can chop off my
That's
hand,
that's a reference. Yeah. Yeah.
but a
Yeah.
hand still
Congratulations.
exists. But
No,
a
a
hand
hand
still
is a reference that's
exists.
physical.
The hand
You
still
just
exists.
debunked yourself,
Okay.
dude.
No, I did not debunk
Is a
anything.
hand
Hold
physical?
on. Does
Is a
friendship
hand
exist?
physical?
Jim Bob, does friendship exist? Yes or no?
A friendship? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Friendship's not physical.
Yeah. Why did you point to a hand then?
No, hold on. I used hand as an example, but then you said hand
Yeah.
has to
Do
be
you have a right?
physical.
Yeah. Do you have a
You
right to
implied that
friendship?
an existent has to be physical.
Do you have
But
a
then
right
you
to a
said
friendship?
friendship.
Hold
But hold
on.
on. No, but that's
Hold
irrelevant
on.
to the
Okay, cool.
conversation. It's
What is it?
entirely irrelevant.
I get it.
You're coming at me with entirely irrelevant questions. First, you entirely misrepresented my opening statement. You said I didn't provide multiple definitions to the term rights. You said that I didn't define morality. You said that I said that morality needs rights,
I asked
all
you
things
for an
I didn't
example,
say. And
Michael.
now you come at me with multiple
Michael, I
questions that have
asked you
nothing
for
to
a
do with the
specific
topic.
example of a right that is you just
And I
innately
gave it to
have.
you. I gave it to you.
And it's what? Someone can pursue whatever they want, right?
A person has the right to make choices that they think are going to further their
Cool.
own
I have a
interests.
choice. I think I have a choice to steal from people to further
Mhm.
my idea of what progress is for me.
Sure.
You have a right to do that?
No,
Okay, cool. So you just debunked yourself. That's a
I did
contradiction.
not, because if
You
you
did.
go
That's a
back, no, I
contradiction.
did not. It's not a
Of course
contradiction.
it's a
No,
contradiction.
no, hold on. Notice
I,
you
I I
just said,
want to gather some more understanding of why it doesn't work based on
Sarah,
what
can
you're
I
saying,
answer his
Michael.
question first, and
That's that's
then
what
I'll
I'm
answer.
asking. That's what I'm
I,
asking is for you to
but,
explain it.
no, I will, but can I answer his question first, and then I'll answer whatever question you want to ask?
That
Is that
that
okay?
was my question. I wanted
Okay.
to allow
So
you the
note
basic.
that he said I contradicted myself and said, therefore, I've debunked myself. Note also that earlier on, I said that a person has the right to make choices that he judges to be in furtherance of his life, as long as he respects the
That's called
equal right of
stealing, dude.
others to do the
Jim Bob,
same.
hold
And
Why
on.
in
ought no,
Hold
go,
on,
why?
hold
Jim
on.
Bob.
Can you, dude? You keep interrupting me. What's
Jim
up
Bob,
with
hold
that?
on. Let him finish.
What's up with that?
Yeah,
So
because you're
my
saying
point,
something that
no,
can
my point was that to assert a right for myself and to deny it to others would be a contradiction. That's why I said one. That's one of the reasons. I mean, there's multiple others, but that's the relevant one
Michael,
here.
the
It would be a
affirmative
contradiction. Jim
Michael,
Bob said that I
dude,
didn't say that I contradicted
Michael,
myself when I didn't, but then he said contradictions debunk.
Michael,
So people be the
Michael,
judge.
Michael, the person who's aggressing denies that rights exist for themselves and others. They're winner
Who
take all.
cares?
You j-
That
look,
that's
you just
irrelevant.
I let you talk, right? You know, you're interrupting me. You just said a person has the right to pursue their wants and desires so
Mm,
long as they don't aggress. And I said,
sure.
why can't they aggress, right? And you said, because it would be a contradiction because that person's assigning rights for themselves and not
Mhm.
acknowledging the others. I'm saying, no, there's a hypothetical that happens all the time where the person aggressing
Mm,
totally denies rights for themselves and others. They merely say,
sure.
I'm going to get mine. That's it.
Okay.
They get mine. They don't talk about rights. They just want to get there,
Okay.
right?
So
So it's not a contradiction.
no, no, let me look. Let's step back and look at this from this point of view. We're looking at two people. If I assert one person has rights, I have to assert that the other person has rights.
Uh-huh.
Both people have rights. Neither has the right to violate the right of the other, because to assert that
You
would
just not
be a
hear what I just said?
contradiction. That would be a
That's only a
contradiction.
contradiction for people who believe in rights,
No,
dude.
it's not. No,
Yes, it
because
is.
rights are factual. They're not
No, that's
dependent on
begging the
belief.
question.
It's not begging the question. I don't think you know what
Where is
begging
a
the
right
question means.
factual in a society that denies rights?
Because the right is not dependent on what the government says or what
Where are
anybody else
rights?
says.
Dude, just
I
answer the
just
question.
hold on. I've
Mm,
just told you
You're
rights
not answering my
emanate.
question,
I've
dude.
answered it 15 times.
Where are
Right?
rights in a
I
place
think
that
Jim
denies rights?
I think Jim Bob, I think you're not satisfied with his answer, and I can understand why, because you're expecting a specific answer and he's giving something different. I think you're both coming to from two very different perspectives, and it's what's causing the conflict in understanding. Michael, you're welcome to continue on.
I kind of forgot where I was, but it doesn't matter. I'll go back to the original thing. Rights are factual descriptions of what human beings have, right? And I've stated it multiple times. If a right is a moral claim to something, which is the definition of the term, a human being has to have the right to that which makes morality possible: his life, his freedom of choice, his rational faculty, all these things. But to assert one person has the right to do these things, but another person doesn't, or this person can violate this person's right, would be a contradiction.
Yeah, for people who acknowledge rights, that's not a
No, you don't
contradiction.
have to
Dude, I
acknowledge
just let you
anything.
talk. Shut up for a second.
I'm agreeable. Hold on.
Look, the person who denies rights exist for themselves and others, it's not a contradiction. It's only a contradiction if someone assumes rights exist for themselves. I'm
Mhm,
pointing to a scenario, right? Where the person and the group, they just go, what are you talking about? Rights. Where's the right a fact in the world, right? Trees exist. That's a fact in the world. Lions exist. That's a fact in the world. I
mhm,
want stuff. That's a fact in the world. There are people who want stuff, right?
mhm,
Right? They can act on those desires. That's factual. You're just saying rights are factual, and you're
mhm.
not telling us where, because do isn't the case that facts relate to reality in some way?
Absolutely.
Okay. So where is the reality of rights existing if two people, one can deny them and you can affirm them? The one denying says, "Hey dude, I don't see how rights exist if all you're referring to is people want to pursue things, right? They just want to pursue things. There's a group of people who want to pursue, they're warlords, right? They're going to use force and coercion and all this kind of stuff, aggression. They're going to get what they want. You're going to say, "Hey, bro, you're in a contradiction." They go, "No, Michael, I'm
Sure.
sorry. I don't
Mhm.
acknowledge rights. Where's the contradiction?"
No, 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 no. They're
No,
not
no, no.
contradicting. They're not contradicting themselves.
Thank you.
No, the contradiction is if we're having a discussion about who has rights, we would have to say there's equal rights on both sides. We would then identify the aggressors that you're talking about as rights violators.
Okay. So
That's
does a
all.
country have the right to not acknowledge rights?
No,
They don't.
no.
So, do you have the justification to invade a country that doesn't acknowledge rights?
It's a very complex question that you're asking. And I'll tell you
It's
why.
pretty
Would you
simple.
hold on, would, if you're asking me, would a rights respecting government, right? Would that government have the right to remove another government that doesn't respect rights? And I would say, yeah. But again, that's not relevant to what we're talking
That's a
about.
contradiction.
It's not a
It
contradiction.
is because it's
No,
removing the person, the
no,
country's
it's
choice.
no, it's
It's
defense of
violating their choice,
others.
dude.
It's no, it's defense of others. If that country is violating people's rights,
No,
you
no.
said they were
That's the
violating
question.
rights.
No, they didn't acknowledge rights. Okay. Isn't it possible, Michael, that there's
Oh,
a
oh,
country?
oh, okay. I misunderstood the question.
Let
You're
me answer it.
saying, okay, so
Let
you're
me give you the
saying they,
hypothetical. Let me give you the hypothetical.
okay, go
There's a
ahead.
country that denies the Enlightenment concept of a right, right?
Hmm.
This sort of privileged position. You're able to have this. You're able to have that. Entitlements without any duties. It's totally possible for a country to acknowledge duties as their main thread of behaviors. And you could say you're violating your duty, you're not fulfilling your duty. And that's where they start judging people, right?
Hmm.
That's how they organize their law, for instance.
Hmm.
They don't need the concept of rights to actually facilitate a society that operates based on duties. So if there's a country that only operates based on duties, and you are a neighboring country that operates based on rights, if they
Hmm.
deny rights in their country, you said the denial of rights would justify the invasion of that country.
What I said was, if that government is violating rights, which I assume they were by your question, but you might be, but you
They
might,
don't accept that rights exist. They
they
can't
don't
violate something
have
they don't
to.
believe in.
Yeah, of course you can.
Do you believe in sin?
Jim Bob.
Do you believe in sin? Yes or no?
No.
Okay,
Can I
I believe
sin?
in sin. I believe in
Can I
sin.
sin?
No, from you, you can't
No,
violate
no,
because
no, 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 no.
you
I'm
can't.
asking you as a fact. Can
Can
I
I
sin?
can you sin? From my perspective, yes, but I
No,
can't
no.
do
As a
anything to you, right?
factual matter, can I sin? From your
Yes, you can,
okay.
from my perspective.
Whether I acknowledge it or not, I can sin. And
No,
whether or not you violate rights, you can violate
okay, cool.
rights.
So I don't know if you understand what you just did. If a Christian society determines and swaps rights with sin, and they
Sure.
determine that they're going to use force, and if you violate yourself or others from a sin perspective, they could
Mhm.
legally use force because you justify the use of force if someone violates rights. If based on
They
that
could
logic,
legally do it,
hold on,
yeah.
based on that logic, a Christian society could annihilate rights and only swap it out for sin and say, people who sin, we're going to jail you. And you'd have to agree to it.
Sure. No, I wouldn't have to agree.
Yeah,
They
you
would be
would.
wrong. No, I wouldn't.
Why
You
not?
you are
It's
because
literally
you're
the same
jumping.
model.
You're no, we're not because first of all, because sin doesn't exist.
I
So
say rights don't exist.
I know, but it's a
Hallelujah.
factual matter. Listen,
Unbelievable, this guy.
Jim Bob, there's people that say all
Rights
kinds of
sin
things that
doesn't
aren't
exist.
true.
I say rights don't exist.
And that's
Prove
why
it.
we're debating the subject.
Prove they exist.
I already demonstrated
Prove
it.
they
Just
exist.
because
I
you don't accept it doesn't mean anything. And because Sarah laughs doesn't mean
Prove
anything.
they exist.
I
I think
already
that's actually
did.
a good analogy, recognizing that you just said you don't believe in sin, Michael, correct? And Jim
No,
Bob said you don't believe in sin.
no.
Right.
So I
And
can't
Jim
jail you
Bob
for violating,
does.
right?
But Jim Bob is saying in a hypothetical society in which Christianity
Yeah.
says if you sin, we can, enforce X, Y, and Z. But you're saying, well, I don't believe in sin. Even
Mhm.
though you're living in that society, I don't believe in sin,
Sure.
but they can still enforce,
Yeah.
or take away or do all those things. So what Jim Bob is saying, and I just want to make sure the translation is coming over, is switch out sin for rights. Jim
Mhm.
Bob is saying, I don't believe they exist. You're saying they do. So it's the same analogy across the board between the two of you.
So, Sarah, nothing can prevent somebody other than self-defense, obviously. But if somebody wants to violate rights, they can. The point of the matter is that's why we want to convince people of a rational morality and of the existence of rights. That's why, so that you can subordinate might to right. If rights could not be violated, there'd be no need for them. Who would care?
What's
Right.
the
But I
Michael?
think what Jim Bob is saying is that the rights don't exist.
I
Right. So
know.
You have to prove they
like,
exist first.
And
yes.
and what I've said multiple times. I explained the whole theory of morality, right? And then I said to if this is the correct theory of morality, and a right is a moral claim, something you're morally entitled to. If morality means acting in furtherance of my life, then I am morally entitled
So
to do
pagans are
so.
justified because
What
taking
do you mean?
over pagans who appeal to war and carnage and taking over societies, they have the declarative right, and it's totally consistent within their systems that they declare they have the right to take over neighboring societies, right? You're not making any distinction between one set of people who define what furthering is for them
It
and another
doesn't
side.
matter. It's
It
not a
doesn't
matter
matter
of
now? Okay,
opinion.
it doesn't matter.
No,
So
their
are you a
opinion.
moral relativist?
Listen, no, opinion doesn't matter in this. No, you are ascribing to being saying, well, if this person believes this or this person believes that.
It doesn't
That would
matter.
be moral relativism. What I am saying is that it's irrelevant what they believe, that the moral facts are facts. Either
Moral
something
facts are
furthers
facts.
my life or it doesn't. So, I mean,
Further,
I
dude,
can drink
Michael,
cyanide
further
and
life,
say this. Hold on, I
furthering
can drink.
life, furthering life, Michael, is ambiguous. Do you understand that one set of a society in one area and a
It's
society
really
in another?
not.
Hold on,
It's
dude.
not ambiguous.
Uh, are you aware that a society in one area and a society in another area could totally disagree on what's furthering life?
Of course they can. They can
Okay,
disagree on all kinds
consistent.
of things. They can disagree on the propriety of
That's
child
checkmate.
sacrifice. Who cares if they
That's
what they
checkmate. What do
believe?
you mean? Who cares? That's checkmate to your entire
No,
argument.
no, it's not. You're
If
saying that
two,
it's a matter of opinion. It's
if
not. It
two,
doesn't matter if they
okay, cool.
disagree. The fact that you think that's checkmate is really a
If
demonstration
two
of your
neighboring
lack of understanding of the
if
arguments.
if two neighboring societies disagree on what's furthering, they
Yeah.
don't agree with your standard of what's furthering.
Okay.
How are you going to tell them they're wrong?
Well, what we would have to do is have a discussion, have a debate. We'd have to try to teach them, learn, whatever. That's how we do
That's
things.
what we're
We
doing right now. You're the one
exactly.
debating.
So hold on. The fact that you and I disagree, right? Does that demonstrate that neither one of us is correct?
No, but if you're the one
So if two
affirming,
societies disagree,
if
how does it prove that they're both
Michael,
not correct?
Michael, if you're the one affirming that there's a correct way and the correct way is rights,
Yeah.
I'm asking you because you're in the hot seat. If two neighboring societies disagree on what constitutes furthering, what's better for them,
Yeah.
I asked you, how are you, Michael, in the hot seat going to determine? You said we're going to debate. We're doing that right now.
Oh,
How are
okay.
you going? What's the method that you're going to determine that they're
Well,
wrong about what constitutes
if
furthering their society?
because it's not furthering their society. We're talking about individual lives, right? There are things now there's very concrete things that are harmful to a human life. Regularly ingesting heroin and alcohol are just examples that would destroy somebody. Right? We could agree to that. That's automatic. We know that. But then there's things that are tougher to figure out. The type of relationships a person gets into, the type of people one hangs out with. Are these things benefiting them? And those are complex questions that you'd have to have, real knowledge of the inner workings of these relationships. The only point, and that's why I stated it clear as day at the beginning, is all we have to show is that all I need to do, rights are a moral claim to something. That's what rights are. That's what they've always been defined as. Rights are a moral claim to something that necessitates a theory of morality. What is morality? And how do we arrive at it? Morality is a code of values adopted by choice. Who adopts values by choice? Human beings. What is a value? Two senses: that which one seeks to gain and or keep, any object or quality desirable as a means in itself. They're in the only entities that give rise to such a subject as, or rather, a conclusion as something good or bad is life. And the
Michael,
only life that can choose are humans.
Michael,
You
people
can
can
say Michael in a condescending voice all you
don't get
want.
upset. Don't
You,
get upset. I'm just
I'm
trying
not
to
upset.
look. People can have the choice to pursue their desires. Correct? Is that still moral?
What do you mean? What
What
are
do I
their
mean?
desires?
Yeah, exactly. So if someone has, I'm trying to get the baseline position is that you think a right is someone's ability to choose and act on their desire, right?
No, I
So
never
what
said
is
that, not even
so what
once.
is it
I
then?
never said that. I
You just
said,
said a
no,
right is a moral
no,
claim on acting
yeah,
on your desire.
no, I didn't. I said a person has a right to act on what they judge to be in their best interest, i.e., what is best for their life. It's not just a desire that
And
happens to
and
come out of
what's the
nowhere,
standard for what's best for their life?
their life.
No, what's the
What do you
standard
mean?
for what's
Hold on.
best for their life, dude?
That which keeps them alive
So
as a
so
hold on, but let me just clarify something
uh-oh,
here.
you're in trouble
No,
now.
dude, you
That
can.
which keeps them
Here's the thing,
alive, right?
dude. Hold on.
Okay.
In what?
Are you ready to are you ready to
World,
commit to that?
dude? No, because you interrupted me. That which keeps them alive, but it's
Yeah.
not a temporary survival. It's not survival as a brute. It's a survival as a human being across a lifespan, which means that things have to be intact. It can't be just surviving attached to machines where somebody else has to keep them alive. It has to be survival as a rational entity that can continue to act in furtherance of their life. I mean, I don't know, like this tactic you have, oh, you're cooked. And like, I
Do you
get that
understand?
plays to an audience, but that's not
Okay,
a real
cool.
debate
Yeah,
tactic.
it is. Well, no,
No, it's really not.
I didn't
It's
say
really
any
not.
dude, listen, the audience gets to decide that first of all. They have the choice, Michael, to decide that for
Yeah,
themselves.
but
Second of
that
all,
doesn't
hold on,
determine the
dude, I
truth or
just let
falsity
you
of
talk.
something.
I just let you talk.
After
Okay.
you interrupted me 100 times.
Do you have anything more to say? I'll let you go for another
No,
minute if you
no,
want.
no, I don't need to.
Okay.
I want to know what Sarah has to say.
Sarah's the moderator. Okay.
Yeah,
So
she's chimed in before. Why can't she
look,
chime in now?
well, listen, you don't have to derail like that. If it's
I'm
the
not.
case, that a group of people or an individual gets together with a group of people and they say, you know what we determine is better for us, what's furthering us,
Hmm.
is to gain in resources through coercion and force.
Hmm.
That's what's better for us.
Hmm.
Michael comes along and he goes, No, 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 no. I know you guys can demonstrate that's better for you based on your standard, but I'm asking you to abandon that standard because there's a moral fact here that your pursuit of what you want isn't actually better for you. Well, how do you determine what's better for someone if they're just deciding we're going to take what's mine? I'm going to move from location to location, and I'm going to use force and coercion and aggression and threats, and I'm going to gain resources. I'm going to gain water. I'm going to gain food. I'm going to gain women. I'm going to gain slaves.
Hmm.
All of that, they determine that that's what's best for them, Michael. From
Okay.
your moral system, how are you going to tell them that that's wrong, given that that's your system?
Okay. First of all, if we're back to the original point that I made, that nobody has the right to violate the rights of others, which they would be doing, whether they knew it or not, whether they believed it or not. Now, if you're asking me, how do I demonstrate to people that initiating force and using violence isn't actually in their interest? Well, I would say Adolf Hitler thought that he could go and conquer Czechoslovakia. He was going to take the Sudetenland, and that was going to be great for him. He was going to invade Poland. He was going to establish the 1,000-year Reich, right? How did that work out for him?
That's a fallacious argument.
It's not a fallacious argument because we can see it over and over again that
So if something's
initiators of
good, it
force,
survives. That's your argument.
not just
That's
survives.
literally your argument is that it
No,
see how it went
no.
for them. It went badly.
Yes, it
You
went
can
badly
point
for
no,
them.
you can point to societies like Islam's doing fairly well using their methods. No?
Not really. No,
No, no, they're not. Okay.
they're constantly at war with one another. That's the first thing. Secondly, within their societies, you have to ask whether they're prospering. But again, we're deviating from the original topic, the original question. You
Where do
have,
rights come from?
and I told you, rights come from the nature of human beings as rational entities with freedom of choice, moral entities with freedom of choice.
Hold on.
That's where rights come
Hold
from.
on a second. The opposite comes from humans too.
What?
The opposite of acknowledging rights still comes from humans who think
Sure.
use their rationality to determine what
Yeah.
they want and to act on what they want. So
So what?
you're saying rights come from the rational human acting on choice, and I'm saying the
That's not what
complete
I said.
what
I
everything
never
that's
said that. I never
everything
said that.
hold on,
Never, not once.
everything that's antithetical to rights also comes from the same source.
So what? What does that mean? That has
So
nothing to do
why
with the
should we
topic.
why ought given that rights are by the way, if someone violates in your instance, give me an example of a violation of a right. Just a simple example, just really clear.
If I decide that I'm going to, after the show, walk to the store and somebody comes up to me and punches me in my face and takes
Okay.
my wallet,
Okay. So where in the exchange was the right?
the right is my right to make my decision to go to the store. If the person attacks me, I am then morally justified in
No.
responding in
No,
self
no.
defense.
Where the question, Michael, is where in the exchange the
I just
actual
told
thing
you
on
a right
no,
is a
no, no,
right to
no,
action. I just
dude,
told you where it
dude.
is.
The right to action, the other guy took an action. He used his right to action. I'm asking you a very
That's
specific
not
question.
his right.
Yeah, dude, that's
No,
question begging. I'm asking you
it's not
where
question. Do you even know what these terms mean that you're
where
Yeah.
using?
where in the exchange physically that's happening? You're walking to the store, someone aggresses you.
Right.
In the exchange, where is the right?
JimBob, you're assuming that you have to have a physical right, but you don't. Where, when two people are walking down the street, where is the friendship?
Well, can I
Where,
ask?
if,
Because
go ahead.
I am still having a hard time ensuring I understand your position completely. But you mentioned earlier that the right is, having that decision to do something in the best interest of your life and to
Go ahead.
thrive
Say
in
that
your own.
again, Sarah. I'm sorry. What did you
The
say?
you said the right stems from a person's ability to like choose the best interest for themselves, right? Their
No, I
life.
said no. I said that the right stems from a human, the nature of a human being as a moral entity. That's where rights stem from.
Okay. So I want to flip that because I want to
Okay,
understand it from the guy who punches you,
sure.
right? Is that his right to come and punch you based on what
No,
you're
no, no.
so well because you're saying it's like it's natural and it's human, right? We're born and
Right.
we have it, correct?
Yes.
Based on that
Now, well,
morality
hold on. We're born and
worded?
we have it. I'm not prepared. That's a complex question that has to do with
Okay.
with children and what their decision making capacities are and what rights they have, and that's something that I haven't really delved a lot into. So,
Okay, maybe
but
that's a
we
starting point then. At what point does a person's rights begin
for
based on what you're
for
claiming?
absolute certainty, once a person is making choices on their own,
Uh-oh,
at
hold on.
that point
Okay, hold on. Hold on
At
here.
that point, that person can when a person is making free choices, that
Okay,
person can behave morally or
okay.
immorally,
S
rightly or wrongly.
so a
Does that hold
person
on? Oh, but can I just ask Sarah if that answered her question? That's what I want to know because you were going to go
I
somewhere else.
I think that kind of answers it, but I that actually runs me down a whole nother line, and I think Jim Bob's gonna go down that same line.
so
So
if someone's incapable of making choices, do they have no rights to live?
Honestly, I'm going to be honest with you. It's a very difficult question to answer. It's something that I have not delved into a lot, and I don't know the answer to that. I mean, if I don't know, I don't know.
Well, no,
I
if the
don't know
first
the answer to the
I
question.
know, but well, the answer is an entailment of your statement. So entailments are answers that are consequential to your statement. So if your statement is the rights exist when a person's capable, becomes capable, or maintains the capability of making choices and acting on the choices, right, in a meaningful way. There are plenty of people who can't do that on their own. Do they just not have rights?
Well, what do you mean can't do it on their own?
They can't make choices.
No, no, what I'm saying, are you talking about somebody, for instance, that's in a wheelchair? Or are you talking about somebody that doesn't have the mental capacity to make
Mental
choices?
capacity,
Okay,
like
in
a
that in
dysfunctional autistic person.
okay, in that case, I'm telling you, I don't know the answer to that question.
Well, no, the answer is already answered by your
N-
standard.
But it's
What do you
not.
mean? You can't contradict your standard and be like, "You know what?
No.
I declare that someone has rights when they're
Okay.
capable of XYZ." And then when they're not, you go, "Well, I'm not sure about that."
Well, okay, no, I'm telling you that
You bite the bullet.
there may be an argument for it. I ultimately do not know. You might be right about this. It's something I'm not going to answer you on the fly when it's a topic I haven't thought about or I haven't come to definitive conclusions on. I'm not just going to say I agree that what you're saying
Okay.
has some sense to
You
it. I'm not going to
you
deny
never
that.
thought about this. Okay, does everyone under
Mm-mm.
your view have the right to own a gun?
Does everyone have the right to own a gun? Mm, I don't know about
What do you
everyone. I
mean?
mean, that's a broad thing. I told you at the beginning, I'm not going to list a catalog of rights and say everything a human being
Okay.
has a right to
Okay.
because I don't know.
Okay, cool. Well, if it's the case that in a society that appeals to rights, and you can't tell me if everyone should be able to have the right to own a gun, that you're basically conceding that the government could actually come in and determine certain people don't have some rights and some people do have rights based
Hold
on
on.
some sort of criteria, which you already conceded to. Your criteria was mental criteria. We already
No, it's
demonstrated
not
that
only mental
people
criteria.
don't
No,
all have the right to vote. People don't all have the right to own a gun.
no,
Based on the
I can't.
situation, we could remove those rights. It
Because you're saying
demonstrates
things
that
I never
government gives you
said.
rights. Not it's not
No,
inherent
no,
in
no, I
any
haven't.
reality.
I never, no, nothing I said. Of course, the government can violate your rights. I said this 15 times. I don't know why I have to keep saying it.
No, no, dude.
A government can
It's worse
violate
than
your
that.
rights. Individuals can violate your rights. The entire reason we need rights is because they can be violated.
Okay.
If they couldn't be violated, there would be no concept. There'd be
Okay,
no
Michael,
reason to
if it's the
elucidate it.
case that not everyone has the right to own a gun,
I
isn't
didn't
it the
say
case?
that. Hold on. I didn't say it's the case
Does
that not
everyone have
everyone
the
has the
right
right
to
to
own a
gun.
gun?
I said I don't know because I
That's such a
don't.
cop out.
It's not a cop out.
Yeah,
I
it is.
haven't thought about that topic. So I have to give you an answer to every single hypothetical question you're going to
That's a
ask me.
really clear, relevant hypothetical, dude.
What I will say to you is this: everybody has a right to self-defense.
Except
That I
not
will
the
say.
tools to self-defense. That makes a lot of
No,
sense.
no, I didn't say they didn't have the right. I said I don't know. What do
Okay,
you
if
want
every
me to do?
if
Lie and say I've thought about this, I know
look,
the answer?
Michael, if everyone
All
has
I'm
the
prepared to say is that human beings are moral entities, and because we're moral entities, we have rights. That's it.
if
I'm
everyone
not going to catalog every
okay,
potential
okay.
right a
If
person can
everyone
have.
has a right to self-defense, but not everyone has a right to equal um mechanisms of self-defense. For instance, let's say everybody's had the right and obligation to own a firearm and carry it on them. And there's some people, you said, well, I don't know if everyone has the right to own a gun. In the instance where everyone else has a firearm and some do not, how does it follow that they actually have the right to defend themselves
Well,
if you're
well,
restricting your capability of defending
here's
yourself?
why. Because and this is again beyond the scope of what we were supposed to be talking about, which is where do rights come from?
From the
You're
government.
trying to argue about specific rights that a person has in society. But when people have rights, there's also ways you can forfeit your rights. For instance, if I go in, like I spent 25 years in prison, right? Because I violated people's rights. I used physical violence against multiple people. So I was justifiably deprived of my rights. So, if is it just or is it right to deprive me from having a gun? Probably, because I've demonstrated myself not responsible
Okay.
with the
I
weapon.
understand. I understand your hypothetical, but who
That's
or
not a
what,
hypothetical. I just
who,
gave you a factual
who,
case.
who in that scenario took away your rights?
Well, here's where this is ultimately
You
the
can't
point.
answer a direct
No, I
question,
can
dude.
I no, I can answer the
Who in
direct
that
question.
scenario
Oh,
took away your rights?
what do you mean who
Who
deprived me of
or
my rights?
what in
Oh,
that
the state of
scenario?
Connecticut did.
State, great. So the state took away your rights.
Sure.
Your assumption is that everyone has rights. It's a part of nature of being a human being. If the state can take away the rights, isn't it the fact that the state could actually give you back your rights?
My hold
If
on,
the
hold on, hold on,
state
hold on, hold
could
on. I'm going
take
to
away
answer you.
your
Do you
rights, that's
mean my legal rights or my
what
natural
else do we
individual
mean?
rights?
What else are we meaning here?
From the start, from the very start, rights precede the theory of rights. The idea of rights necessarily must precede government.
Really?
In no, not
In the
every
woods where
government.
there are
No,
rights.
no, no, not every government. What I'm saying is we form a just government. A rights respecting government is formed based on the nature of rights, based on a theory of rights. So, yes, obviously, a government can violate rights, but that doesn't mean they grant them. That's not the same thing.
Okay, if
There
it's
are,
I
hold on, let me clarify for you, John.
dude.
There are legal rights that they create, but that's a different type of right than what we're talking about.
Okay, so there's rights to have a gun or vote and do this or that, right? And you
Do
just
I get to
said,
ask any questions or is it just all
"Oh,
him asking
I
me?
don't make the positive position. You're in the
No, I'm
defense."
asking her though. It's Sarah. You're the moderator. You said
What
we
could
could
you
ask
Um,
each
possibly
other
ask me?
questions. Is it
so
just him asking me? Because that's all we've been doing the whole
You're the
time.
that's
affirmative, bro.
part of taking the affirmative
Oh,
stance.
okay. All
The
right.
the
But that
negative typically, so it's especially because he's like a hard negative stance. He's saying it absolutely doesn't exist, right? You're saying it does exist. So you have
mhm.
the absolute
Okay.
affirmative.
All right. Okay. No,
Um,
that's fine. That's
that
cool.
doesn't mean you're not allowed to ask
Mm.
questions. He's just trying to dig into, and I'm still a little. I think I feel like I think you like if you
Can I say something
the
to you,
way you
Sarah?
guys define rights are two completely different things. His is based like Jim Bob is recognizing rights based on like what the government grants or
Right. Okay.
protects, right?
What's the
You're
distinction?
defining rights based on like you just automatically have it.
And you,
What?
Michael, you brought that up too,
Hold
by
on
the
a
way,
second.
just to be
Can I
fair. You
answer
brought
Sarah
in
real
that you got
quickly?
your rights revoked, right?
No,
You're the one who brought in legal rights, not me.
no, no. Well, you've been invoking the concept of legal
So what's the
rights
distinction
all
for the
along.
audience and
Well, hold
myself?
on.
Legal rights.
That's where
Okay.
I need the
So Sarah,
clarity because
Sarah,
you're
that's what
talking
I'm going
about
to
two
answer
different
for you,
things.
Sarah.
Okay.
So there, and that's why in the beginning, if you note at the very beginning of my statement, I said in this context, because governments can say that you have a right to, for instance, health care, or you have a right to housing. People argue that you have a right to a job. Franklin Roosevelt famously, developed the new Bill of Rights and said you had all kinds of rights. Those are called in literature or in legal discourse positive rights. Those are things that government grants you. But if you look up natural rights are things that exist independent of what a government says. The manner in which I defined rights as a moral claim to something, that is what historically has been referred to as natural rights, or in the present context, how I would rather refer to them as individual rights, but I'm okay with natural rights too. So you're correct, Sarah. There's a distinction. There's two different types of rights. Obviously, there's the right in the legal sense where the government grants things and says you can do this or that. The object is what the natural rights philosophers did, what natural law philosophers have been arguing back
Mhm.
since the Stoics in ancient Rome, and even you can go back to the Sophists in pre-Christ in ancient Greece. argue that the law ought to be on the side, so you'd have legally granted right. The legally protected rights are in line with natural rights. Now, I want to just say something quickly here about this.
Mhm.
I've debated philosophers, economists, professors on this subject. Nobody ever has a hard time understanding what we're talking about, ever, ever.
Wow.
Listen, I will say, listen, go watch my debate with Walter
So,
Block, David
You're
so
not
Friedman.
I
Watch
have
watching
it
debates
here.
to,
right now, dude.
I have to ask. Okay, so if you're saying that the natural right is what we'll call it going forward is based
Okay.
on morality, right? Then where
Yes.
is that morality derived from?
And that morality, as I said earlier, morality is a code of values adopted by choice. That's a moral code. There's different moral codes, right? You have a Christian moral code. You have
So is your
Islamic
definition
moral code.
is your
No,
definition
no.
cyclical then? Because it
Why
sounds like
ought we
one
why
depends
ought we
on the
value
other.
morally choice? Why ought we value choice?
You ought. Here's where the main thing comes in. If you want to live, and I'm assuming anybody that's asking how I should live is interested in living, there are certain things that you have to do in order to live. It's that simple. There's certain actions that you have to take. There's certain things that are good for you and certain things that are bad for you. That's a code of morality. It's a teleological code
Why,
of
dude,
morality.
stop.
Deontological codes do not preempt
I
the field.
already debunked this because I
You
could
didn't
just
debunk
yeah,
anything. You
it's
just
because
said
dude, I can just give you an example of another group of people who
that
simply says,
doesn't
no,
matter.
listen, I can give an example of a group of people who they define that what's best for them is to take,
Sure.
right?
Right.
That's a view that they can take, right? From your view, why ought we value choice?
We ought to value choice. Well, first of all, it's not even a matter of
Oh,
valuing
here he
choice.
goes. Here he
We
goes. Here he
have
goes
choice.
again.
Dude, listen,
Here he
hold
goes
up.
down the
Dude,
path
no,
over
because
here.
you're not.
All
Here's the
right,
thing,
all
and
right,
here's the
all
thing. If
Simple,
right.
direct
we could get
question,
going
dude.
now. Listen, here's the
Stop
thing. We could get
obfuscating.
going.
You're
No,
obfuscating.
you're obfuscating because ultimately
You're
you don't
running.
understand.
Oh, I
That's
don't
the
understand.
problem.
Gaslight me now.
No,
Answer
you
the
don't.
question.
I answered it
All
15
right.
times.
Why ought we
You don't
value choice?
understand. First of all, I never said we ought to value choice.
Why
Never once
ought we
made the
value
claim.
choih?
I never made the claim.
Oh, you
But
never made the
all
claim
but
we ought
Well,
to
hold on.
value
hold
But
choice
up,
we
now.
hold
hold
on. But
up,
I'll
Dude, you're
tell
hold
you
up,
stupid.
why.
hold
You're
up,
I'll
stupid.
answer the
hold up,
question, but I never
hold
made the
up,
claim.
hold up, hold up.
Hey,
If
JB
if
Pelletier, you stop crying.
What?
I'm
he's
talking to
talking
the
to the
super
super
chat.
chat.
Oh, sorry. I was like, what?
No, not you. You're not. You're not
Oh,
crying.
gentlemen.
You're obstreperous, but I'll grant you're not crying.
Fair enough. All right. Okay. So you're saying we not ought
No,
or we ought.
listen,
I'm
listen.
so confused at what you're saying.
We ought to value choice.
Why?
Y- I should value my choice because choice, if I don't have choice, I can't act in furtherance of my long term best interest. That's why I should value choice.
Okay. Isn't it the case that someone can define their long-term best interest as terrestrial gain by force, by
They
negating
can,
choice?
and
Yes.
they would be wrong.
Why?
Because
Morally.
ultimately, okay, hold on. I'll answer you. Because ultimately, as human beings, we're rational beings. It's in our interest to deal with one another as rational beings. If I initiate force against you, I'm violating your rational faculty. I'm
No, you're not.
denying you the ability, of course I am,
No,
to
I'm
deal
not. No,
with
you're
me
not,
based on
dude. That's
choice.
just an
Of
assertion.
course I am. See, that's the inherent problem with these kind of debates, right? I get this is like a shock jock kind of debate thing, but you ask me a question, I attempt to answer it, and you
Let me
jump in
give you
and
back what
start.
you said.
No, go ahead. Tell me what I said.
So
Given
I
how
asked
many things I said that you got
okay,
wrong already, let's
okay,
see
you're
if you
just
get
gonna
this
stop.
wrong.
Okay, cool. So if it's the case where a group can say, well, I'm gonna use my choice to pursue my best interest is to take from people and use
Yes.
force to do it,
Yeah.
that's proven to be advantageous to my self-interest. You said, well, that's morally wrong because a rational person does the opposite,
That's not what I
basically.
said.
Yeah, it is
It's
what you
not. No,
said.
it's not. It's not even
It's exactly
close.
what you
It's
said.
not even close to what I said.
Of course it
That's
is.
no, it's not. And
You're saying
anybody
a
that
rational person
no,
considers other
hold on.
people, right?
No, what I said to you was that we all our human beings' mode of survival is our rational faculty. That's what I said. I said it's in my interest to deal with other rational people, to allow them to be rational, not to subvert their rational faculty. It's far more advantageous to trade with people than it is to loot people. That's what I said. That's why it's
Really?
a mistake to think that as an individual, you listen, 25 years in prison, I was surrounded by people who thought they could pursue their own interests by violating the rights of others, by initiating force. What happened to them? How did that do for them?
That's in
Once
prison.
you initiate force against, no, they weren't in prison when they acted. They were out of prison. When you initiate force against somebody else, you risk your life, you risk your safety. If
Really?
you're in a society, you risk
Does
your
that include the threat
society.
of force?
The who?
Does that include the threat of force?
What do you mean? Explain.
Okay, you said when you initiate force on people,
Yeah,
you
I would.
risk
Oh, okay.
XYZ.
Yes, yes, yes. Yeah, I would
Does
include
that
the threat
include
of
the
force.
threat of force?
Yes, it
Are
does.
rights completely uh, sustained by the threat of force?
Our right.
Ruh-roh.
Hold on. No, not rut row. No, there's no rut row involved.
Oh, I need
No,
another beer.
dude.
You
Premise
You
guys,
can
one.
listen.
Let
Have
me
as
give you
much.
back. Let me
Listen.
give you
Hold on.
back
No,
to
no,
you.
no.
Dude,
Hold on
you're
a
let
full of
him,
second.
shit now.
No,
Jim Bob,
Keep
let
it
him
moving.
respond.
see, that's
Bob,
the
let
whole
him
thing with this
respond.
style, dude. You can't
The
actually
style where I
engage in.
refute you,
Actually, you didn't refute a thing.
you're
You
in
made a
trouble.
statement.
You're
The threat
mumbling.
of
You don't
force.
even know what to
If
say.
you're, dude, if you're talking about,
Gentlemen,
if
we
you're
can
talking
argue about
about
arguing or we can just make the point.
I'm ready to answer the question.
Go
If
ahead,
you're
Michael.
talking about a threat of force, meaning what defensive force, that does
No,
protect rights. If, if,
no.
if I didn't clarify, then I apologize. The threat of defensive force, meaning if you take my rights, I'm going to defend myself. That's perfectly okay because self-defense, that's the whole point that we started with.
Oh, really?
That is
Okay,
allowable.
well, does the
The
dude,
threat of the initiation of force
does the
is
government
wrong.
does the
What?
government sustain the concept of rights in our system?
In America, you mean?
Yeah.
In some senses, yeah. In some senses, no. In
Does the
some senses,
government
it protects rights. In some
okay.
senses, it
Does the
violates
is
rights.
the government actually coming back to defend you self-defense wise? No.
Was
They're not.
retaliatory force.
No,
I
no, no. Hold on a second.
Well, what do you mean?
Look, no, this is very important here because
Oh, we've
if you're
lost our
saying
moderator.
if you're saying that defense, self-defense is justifiable use of force, right? That's the
Sure,
threat of force. If you do this, I'm going to do this back to you.
sure.
Okay, I understand that. The
Okay,
problem is the government, which is the body that sustains whether or not it was just or not. So let's say I break into your house, Michael, and
yeah.
you believe it's totally just to use a gun on me, right? Right. Even if you believe that's just, isn't it the case that you still have to outsource a deliberation to an authority to figure out whether or not it actually was just or not?
Oh, I would say, yeah. That's
Okay.
actually, can I just tell you, I think
Okay.
it's a good question. And the reason I think it's a good question, because this is actually where I disagree with many libertarians and
I
anarchists,
understand.
because you have to have an objective body, somebody that can put in the procedures, say due
Okay.
process,
I
determine the
understand.
amount of people on a jury, that sort of thing.
What I'm saying is you said, and I agree with you, that if someone aggresses you, you're in the position to defend yourself. To
Sure.
determine whether it's just in this system relies on another entity that monopolizes the force.
I agree.
And their monopoly of the force actually isn't in defense of you or your property. So you have this other use of force, coercive force, threat of force, that actually isn't in the category of self defense.
Well, the question then would come down to, I think you're talking about retaliatory force. If I'm wrong, tell me. Because
Retaliation would be I enter your house and
no, no,
you're
no. But
saying,
so, oh, you're talking about to judge me.
yeah,
Who you,
they're gonna have to judge you. Yeah.
whether or not I was, yeah, what
That's
they're,
a threat of force.
yeah, they're not defending me in that case.
Right.
What they're doing is they're acting as the arbiter of whether retaliatory force would be
With
justified
the
in case of this guy
but that system
or
is
woman. I guess you didn't
isn't
say.
that system that's mediating whether or not you did the right thing, isn't that system completely and wholly dependent on the threat of force?
There's a difference, and this is the key. No, I mean, you can giggle and laugh, but there's
I'm giggling and laughing.
is there not a difference between the threat of initiation of force and the threat of retaliatory force?
The threat of initiated force is
Does it differ from
do
retaliatory
this,
force?
right? Yeah, yeah, there's a difference. But here's the thing, Michael. I'm trying to get you to understand this is that the government points at you and says, you better follow rights. How is that a not initiated force?
because what it's
Look,
doing,
you better follow
no,
rights.
it's not initiated
That's
force.
not initiating force?
No, because what they're telling you is if you violate somebody's rights, we're going to
Yeah.
retaliate against you.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's initiating
that's
force. They're
not
pointing a
initiated
gun and
force.
saying,
No,
"You
that's
better
part of retaliatory
No, no, no.
force. It
No.
is. Yes, it
Look,
is.
look, look. If the government comes in and says, "You better acknowledge rights and behave that way, otherwise this gun," right? How
Yeah.
I know this is true is because there's other countries that doesn't have the system of governance we do. They don't have the body of force. They don't have
Mhm.
that force applicator that says, "Guys, we're all pointing a gun at you, by the way." And we're telling you, you better behave the way we dictate you behave. And if you don't behave this way, here's the gun. That's completely use of initiated force on a society.
I think I missed something. If I say to you, if you go and you punch Sarah, that I'm going to restrain you, that is not a threat of initiated force. It's a threat of retaliatory force.
I'm saying the judger of whether or not you were just is saying, we have a system of behaviors that we permit and don't permit. We're
Yeah.
going to decide because we're the monopoly with the gun. We're going to
Yeah.
decide if you were just. Michael, your philosophy doesn't actually decide if you're just or not. Do you know that?
Oh no. Well, the problem is obviously, and I think I can't imagine you would disagree with this. Governments can behave unjustly, right?
Yeah, I agree, but that's irrelevant to the point
No,
of
it's
whether the
no, it's not
No, it's
because
irrelevant. Why? Because what we're talking about is there's an instance in which someone aggresses on you and then you retaliate, right?
yes.
What I'm saying is in an ordered society that you want to appeal to rights and acknowledge rights. That ordered society actually appeals to another group of people with guns that is constantly initiating force, right?
And what
They're
I'm saying
saying
is that's
if
not
you
initiation of
violate
force.
no, they're saying if you do the wrong thing,
Yeah.
where they're literally pointing a gun the entire time. The reason I know this is if you go to a society that doesn't appeal to rights or a constitution or a bill of rights and civil rights and all these things, right? There is no system that the two parties can appeal that they appeal to. Let's say in the woods, right? But you
Okay.
said these things are natural, but the reality is if you go to what constitutes natural, what's natural seems to be aggression. Maybe people are not aggressive. What constitutes what occurs is different than what ought to occur. And so
Oh,
that's
I
the
agree.
so if it's the case that you're basically in a performative contradiction to say, well, I believe in rights because if you violate rights and you use initiated force or initiated aggression or coercion to say, if you do X, I will do this. You're saying don't do that. And yet the very system that you're arguing for that's just needs to do that. They
No, it
literally
doesn't.
need to do that.
No, that because it wouldn't
Who
be the
established rights exist?
hold on, listen, let me answer your question. If you had a just government, that's what we're going to assume for the sake of this discussion right now. If a just government, by just government, I mean a government that is instituted and restricts itself only to protecting rights, not to violating rights, right? If that government threatens people, if you violate rights, we're going to get you. That's not the threat of initiated force. It's a
Sure
threat
it
of
is.
retaliatory force.
No, because
They're
if you
threatening to retaliate
okay, look,
against
let's put it
somebody
this
that
way.
used force.
Let's put it this way. Do you disagree? Like let's say do you agree, Michael, that
Go ahead.
you can believe whatever you want so long as you don't use force to manipulate others into that belief system?
Say that again. I had a
Do do you agree that the statement, well, you believe what you want. I don't have any problem with people believing anything. Where I
yeah.
have a problem is when you initiate force to force those beliefs on people. Do you agree with that?
Do I
Do-
think
do-
that you should be able to
no,
initiate
no, the
force?
opposite. Sorry, I worded it all sloppy. Do you agree that you can have your beliefs, but I have a problem once you use force to force those beliefs onto people?
To force beliefs onto people? Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
like your beliefs,
No,
you structure society based on
no.
your
The
beliefs.
only proper use of force is in defense or retaliatory force.
I understand, but if that's true, you
But
don't
you're
need a
not
justice
forcing your
system. Hold on,
beliefs. You're not
hold on.
forcing them to believe
If
what you
that's true,
want.
what you just said, then you don't need a justice system.
No, I believe you do. And I mean, we could the
That's the
problem is, listen,
contradiction.
hold on. You and I I mean, ultimately, we can have that discussion at another occasion. I would just reference people to, if you want to see a debate about the point that Jim Bob just made. I debated Professor Humor, Professor Block, and Liquid Zulu, and Professor David Friedman, all on the very topic of whether or not you need a justice system to enforce rights. That Yeah, I'm afraid. I mean, we've got 2 minutes left, but we don't have enough time to debate that
That's
specific issue.
fine, but I just want to point
But
out
I do.
what you
I will
just
say this: I believe that in order to have a rights respecting society, you ultimately do need an organization that has a monopoly on force, and we refer to that organization as government.
okay.
Libertarians disagree.
I understand. But if that's the case, then it's not just inherent and natural. Because if it was just natural that you have the right to defend yourself, then you wouldn't need an external mediator to determine whether or not you were
Why
just
not?
or not. What?
Why not?
What?
I don't
You could just
understand.
declare that you were just in self-defense.
No, no, you couldn't, because I can declare all kinds of things that
Yeah,
are false.
yeah.
That's the problem. You can
Like
declare a falsity. I can could declare, like, for instance, your argument is when I say that rights exist, I'm making a false claim, right?
you're making an
So,
unjustified claim. Not, I
okay,
don't know
that
if it's
okay.
false.
Well, okay, you're saying that I'm not justifying my claim.
Mhm,
So obviously people can say things that aren't true. So somebody can claim to be justified when they aren't. That's
mhm.
irrelevant to the fact of the case.
So this is the thing. If it's the case where uh, an interaction happens between two individuals and you need to outsource whether or not it's just, then the just or moral, the morality and the justness of the situation itself isn't contained in the situation itself. It
What
needs
do
a
you mean by contained?
it. You're
It's a
basically
fact.
saying
Okay, I think I know.
there's a
So,
fact of the matter about right or wrong in a scenario, right?
right. Yes.
Okay. If that's the case, that actually we both agree that actually necessitates a monopoly on a justice system that basically mediates and litigates what the hell happened and whether or not it's just or not. But
Yeah.
what I'm saying is that if your moral claim is that people should have choice, it's the fact that you actually support a system that you couldn't use your choice to deny. You'd be like, I don't like a justice system. You couldn't say that, right? I don't want a justice system. I just want natural engagement between people, right? Like
Hold on a
anarchists.
second. Hold on. Would a person be justified in, is that what you're asking me, in
Yeah,
saying
if
they don't
it's
want to
their
be a part of
yeah,
that system?
if it's their choice that the best thing for them in society is to not have a justice system,
Yeah.
I'm not sure from your standard you could actually argue against it.
What I would say to him, and this is what I have said to the aforementioned anarchists that I debated, is as long as you are not violating anyone else's rights, I don't care what you do. It doesn't matter. You don't
Right,
have to, you don't have
right.
to
As long
acknowledge
as
the
you believe
system.
what I believe, right?
No,
That's all you're
because
saying.
if they go and rob somebody, that's it. It's an objective fact they've committed a robbery, right?
Only
It's
if
an
there's a justice system.
why? You don't have to have a justice system to rob
Well, no,
somebody.
then you need an absolute moral standard against thievery. That's a
I'm
meta that's a
Can
that's
I
a
just
moral.
tell you guys something real quickly? I'm getting an abundance of texts from people telling me about this debate. I wish they would get in on the screen so that everybody can see their their comments. Pay the $5 or whatever it is so that we can discuss what you're saying.
Yeah, I'm just saying that, like, if it's the case that, um, someone said, "Well, I don't believe what you believe in," right? I always bring this up against atheists because if I have a belief in sin, like I brought up before, right, which is
Yeah.
parallel, it's like I believe that people act and there's a moral reality of action, right? And there's a standard to measure it against God, right? And so that to me is similar to the concept of a right, right? Because you're basically saying this behavior is not permitted here. And it's based on a fundamental belief. Your fundamental belief is rights exist. But if someone has the choice to deny that rights exist and they have the choice to organize a society based on rights not existing, I'm not sure what your position could say on it, being that you'd have to violate their belief structure
Hold
to
on one
impose
second.
the concept of rights on them.
Would it be, are you arguing for like a happy and covenant community where everybody in the community agrees to live a certain way?
Yeah, like that's why I brought up duties. Yes.
Oh, okay. So if you're a Christian, I don't want to make
Mhm.
assumptions. I just
Sure.
believe you are.
Yeah.
So if you and say 100 people decide that you're going to live in a community, right? And your community is going to consist of the schools teach religion, you're going to practice the Bible, that sort of thing. You have every right to do that. What you don't have the right to do is force that onto somebody else.
I know, but what if everyone, Michael, in that society agrees,
I just
like
said
a
if
per
everyone agrees, you wouldn't be violating their rights because it would be
Oh,
consensual.
okay, so you admit that rights could actually be overturned and negated based on agreement.
No. Well, I
Yes,
don't know what
yeah,
you
you
no,
just
no,
said
no,
that.
no, no,
No,
no. Hold on. What do you
you
not they're
just said
not
that.
no, 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 no. What do you
Yeah,
mean
you did.
over? I don't know exactly what you mean. That's why I'm
If a
asking.
society that's closed off can all come together, including the people you're calling the victims, they come together and say, you know what? We don't believe in rights. In fact, we trust each other so much that an act of aggression is actually permitted because we trust the deontology system that we have. Even if you thought it was a violation of rights, I'll give you an example. What if I took someone's gun from them in a Christian
Mhm,
covenant community, and
mhm,
you from the outside, Michael, thought that was unjust, but the Christian thought it was just? How would you
mhm.
determine whether or not it violated their rights or not?
That's an interesting question. I ultimately, if it's in a consensual community where everybody pre-agreed to the rules, I would have a very hard time arguing that an external force could go in there and rightfully deprive them or do
Okay.
anything to them because they had the right to make that choice and to enter into that consensual agreement. You
Okay. So
understand what I'm saying?
I
So,
understand, but that
so
means
then
that
then
means
the person's right isn't actually being violated in that
yes, that
scenario.
means that you just conceded that from your view based on that concession that rights are just an agreement. There's nothing
No, no, I did
actually
not
true about
because
this.
no, because I said
Yes,
they
you
had no, because I said they had the right to agree to that community.
yeah.
By the way, that also entails the right to get out if they want to.
Well, I mean, that's just presupposing that rights exist. If a
No,
country agrees
we spent the last
if a country
hour and
agrees
35 minutes
there's if
arguing
a
about right,
country
hour and 29
agrees
minutes, whatever.
that there's no rights, right? They just have like a purge system where it's just like, well, you have a general standard of morality and conduct that's traditional or something like, some sort of ongoing tradition. It's just the way of the land. This is how we've done it all along.
And
You said before,
everybody
wait,
in
hold
there
on, hold
agrees
on.
to it.
You no, not everyone. Maybe there's four people that don't agree, but the fact is so long as that country agreed generally on it, right? Because I'm an outlier in my own country. I don't believe rights exist, and I believe that
Most
the
people
enlight.
don't.
I know, but
You're
the
not an
enlight.
outlier.
Well, no,
Most people don't believe
here.
that.
If I redefine rights, I'll agree that they exist. I'll define it in a way that I agree. Okay, a set of permitted behaviors and restricted behaviors exist in a society that's governed by a monopolized standard body of force. You can do this, you can't do this. Could they change it? Yeah, they can change it. They could actually make it so we couldn't do something that you and I thought was we definitely our right to do. Like they can just change that based on force. So what I'm saying, Michael, is the only thing you're really pointing to, Michael, is that force exists and then some set of agreements exist. And sometimes when you merge force with agreements, you get some type of system.
That's not
But
what I'm saying at all.
but
And
earlier on, you said you have the right to invade another country if they're violating rights. But now, if they agree that in their country they don't acknowledge rights, it's not a violation.
No,
and
what I
I'll
said
let
is,
I'll let I'm gonna let Michael have the
oh,
last
okay.
thought here, and then Jim Bob will move into closing statements, so you'll
Sure.
be
Okay.
next.
That no, what I'm saying is that if everybody in a given community, now obviously the larger you expand that out, the more people included, the less chance you're going to have of universal agreement, right? Like Amish societies, Quaker societies, those types of societies are close knit, small societies agree to live by certain rules. If people all agree to live a certain way, that's their right to do so. Now, there might be, I mean, I can think of hypotheticals where I would say, no, I wouldn't allow that. And they would, if they're raping and torturing women, I don't think that a woman 1 week can say, you know what, 5 years from now, if I don't wear the parka or whatever, everybody can gang rape me. I would have a real issue with that. And I would say they're violating our rights. But generally speaking, people can form communities and live how they want. If a government of a country is actually violating rights, meaning they're using force against someone, that person has not consented to it. If the government does that,
I didn't
then somebody else has the right to remove them.
I
That
didn't
was my
consent.
only
Look,
point.
Let him
Michael, I didn't consent to rights.
You don't have to.
I didn't consent that rights exist.
But you don't
Does
have
the
to
government
consent that they
violate?
exist.
Look, no, no, that's a contradiction. If I didn't consent to
It's
rights
not a
exist,
contradiction.
I didn't consent to
If
living
you
in
don't
this.
hold on, if you don't consent that you have arms, does that make your arms disappear?
No, these are reference, right?
In
I
No.
know I have
today's
arms.
age, in today's age, it does.
Okay.
I didn't. Yeah,
So
I
what do we
didn't.
got
If
to
I
do?
didn't consent, if I don't consent that rights exist, you're
That
basically
doesn't
in a
matter.
contradiction.
No,
Yeah,
I'm
it does
not in a
matter.
contradiction. No,
That
All
means
because
the
right,
they're
government has
factual.
to enforce this belief in rights, right, against my consent.
let's go ahead and
Go
move
ahead.
into closing statements, gentlemen. We will be able to do open panel, so you'll still be able to have,
Okay,
and we also
I
have the super chats too.
I can stay till 10:30, maybe a little after, but I'm already like ready ready to fall asleep.
Okay.
I'm kind of
Is it?
old.
Are you on Eastern Standard Time?
I
Yeah.
am, yeah.
You are.
I'm
Okay.
usually asleep by now or getting
Okay.
ready to
Well,
fall
we'll
asleep.
we'll run through this as quickly as we can.
Okay.
Jim Bob, if you want to give your closing statement,
Sure.
please.
No, thank you for moderating. Thanks, Michael, for jumping on. As a kind of a quick debate here. Yeah, the question of tonight's debate is where do rights come from, right? Ultimately, what is the ontology of rights? What's the status of rights? I, no matter how many times I debate this with people, the people who are affirming rights exist, they can't tell me in which ways they exist, absent that there's just a monopoly of force saying they exist, and if you disagree, we're going to actually put you in jail. If you act in a way in disagreement that rights exist, we're going to jail you, which ironically is the thing Michael has been arguing against, which is this threat of initiated force to say, believe rights exist or else, right? The point is, if rights are anything more than a set of behaviors that you're allowed to do or not allowed to do, if they're more than that, I'm all ears. But when it comes down to it, when you start debating this, the descriptions always come down to where you're allowed to do this and you're not allowed to do that, which is completely consistent with my view, right? His view of rights is that it's a moral claim. Okay. A moral claim to what? A moral claim to pursue what you want so long as you don't violate the moral claim. Well, that doesn't tell me why that's a morally good claim or a valid claim. It just is a tautology. How do you know what a right is? It's a moral claim. Well, how do you know what a justified moral claim is? Well, it's a justified moral claim so long as it doesn't violate the moral claim. Well, what's the moral claim? Well, you can do whatever you want so long as it doesn't violate someone else's rights, the thing in question. Okay. Well, I don't apparently have the right to deny rights and act that way in society. So obviously, there's some restrictions here as far as what I can act on and what I can't. My argument, which is counter to his, is that the only thing you're really arguing in reality is that there is a monopolized system of force that potentially has an ethical system or not. That's basically delineating law from that system, and it's telling you what you can and can't do. That's what's going on. How do I know this? Because you can go to any other country that doesn't have a constitution or anything else that you think is good, and nowhere in reality is you find a right. All you see is the absence of a standardized system of force. Ironically, you don't get to consent to that, by the way. The country itself, the nation itself, was defined and declared without some sort of like consent. You know, should we start a country? Should we fight? Like, what do you think we should do here? No, it was a flag in the ground with a bunch of guns that said, we're going to just establish this thing. We're going to establish an independent system. We're going to do it. And if you disagree, you're at war with us. That to me is literally terrestrial gain. I'm not against it, by the way. I'm not arguing against it. What I'm arguing for is an accurate description of what's actually happening. And what's actually happening is nowhere in these exchanges is there a thing called rights. There's only a set of circumstances, whether you were in the right or in the wrong. And that ultimately has to be informed by an ethical system. And the ethical system, from Michael's view, I'm not actually sure. The ethical system seems to be just don't violate people's stuff, dude. Don't take their stuff. Like, don't be a dick, basically. Well, I demonstrated, like, we could use countless examples of where maybe both of us would agree that you would actually violate their autonomy, their consent to stop something from horrifically happening. I want to also point out that as standard for what constitutes someone has a choice, that they're dignified in their choice and their pursuit of what they find good, is that they are rational, that they have some reasoning faculties. You'll notice that when I cornered Michael on this and I asked, well, what about those who don't have reasoning faculties? He said, I don't know. I just don't know how to answer this. That wasn't the first time he said, "I don't know." There were a couple of corners there. I can't remember off the top of my head where
Guns.
he where he just did. Yeah, guns. Guns is good. Thank you for reminding me. So guns. Yeah. Does everyone have the right to own a gun? Well, he said, "I don't know." I appreciate he said, "I don't know." Maybe that's something to think about. But if you don't know, just know that your objective standard for what constitutes someone's right is actually conditional. So if it's conditional, there's another objective standard for what determines the conditions. And so it keeps going out to a larger worldview, for instance. So, from my view, if I were to counter this with a positive from a Christian lens, I would I would ask everyone in the chat who thinks they have a sworn allegiance to rights. I would ask you to consider, what if it was the case that your life actually that you could live your life based on duties. And if you have a consistent, coherent system of duties and moral duties, I would argue Christianity, specifically Orthodox Christianity, if you have those duties, a lot of times you're not actually going to violate the things that Michael thinks is a violation of rights. But you don't need the concept of rights for that thing to not be violated. You don't even need to point to it if you have a set of duties. The reason duties are important is because under Michael's position, and I know he's not a libertarian, glory to God, he's one step at least away from that, is that when it comes down to like decency, which we didn't get into today, is it is does he have the right to stop someone from hurting themselves or ending their life from his view or not? Is that a violation of the right? I'm not sure. You can maybe add that in his closing. What if all Granny Mildred consented and her whole family consented to posthumous sex with a cadaver? You know, Granny's dead now. No one's being violated because they all consented, right? We were leaning closer and closer to consent. Now, if it's the case that that's his moral standard, I didn't even get into some of the hypotheticals that are reality based, by the way, that he would actually have to bite the bullet on because Granny's dead, nobody's being violated, family consented, they're making some money. Guess what? They're furthering their pursuits in their life. They're getting thousands of dollars from renting out Granny's body. How could he possibly argue against it if it's completely consistent with his ethical view? He can't because no one's being really harmed from his view. With that said, I do invite Michael to maybe debate more with people who actually deny rights. A lot of people on the right, Michael, will say, you know, all the Tapusa people, all the neocons, they'll say rights come from God, right? I think that's a failed position. It might actually elevate your debates and your thinking to debate people who outright deny rights in the future, maybe because this might be the I don't know if it's a first, but it's certainly a more challenging thing than just someone saying God gave me rights, right? I don't take that
No.
position. With
Yeah.
that said, I thought it was a fun debate, well mannered, and I appreciate that.
Thank you, Jim Bob.
All right.
Michael, to you.
Well, thank you both for doing this and agreeing to debate with me. And I must confess, this is much different from the typical debates that I do. Sarah, you informed me in the chat that what you do is blood sport debating. That's not normally what I do, but I had already agreed to do it. I was gonna back out, and I thought about it, and I said, you know what, just go in and do it. But it wasn't that bad. I mean, JimBob gets spirited, and I get it. That's his thing, and whatever. It was better than I would have thought it was going to be. Let me just put it that way. And by the way, I have debated people who don't believe in rights, and I'm more than willing to debate just about anybody as long as it remains respectful. I'm just not. It doesn't do me any good. It's not in my interest to sit there and have a food fight. So now, coming into this, the question was, where do rights come from? We ended up getting into, well, what about this right? Is this a right? Is that a right? And that wasn't my intention, because I know that to do that entails elucidating an entire moral theory. What I mean is, I would have to not only set the standard of morality, but then I would have to define the values and virtues that a person has to adopt to satisfy that morality. And it would have just taken us way off key. So what I did was I defended my term, defined my terms. I'm sorry, from the outset, and I defined rights was a moral claim. I defined morality as a code of values, and I defined values in two ways. Ultimately, what an organism is, once you have a living organism, you have an organism that can live or die. It can go out of existence forever. Those things that keep it in existence, that keep it going, we call good. The things that harm it, we call bad. Human beings make choices. Because human beings don't behave automatically, they have to learn what's good for them and they have to pursue it. For instance, healthy food, say, if you have to get fiber, you have to get vitamins, you need vegetables, salads. Those are the type of things that are good for a human being. But he has to learn that. It doesn't come automatically. Those are things that have value to a human being. So, what my point was, the fundamental point was that given that human beings are moral entities, given that we have to choose, we have to discover the things that are good for us and choose to implement them, that makes us moral beings. That's what morality is. It's a code of values. Because we have that, we have to have the right to the preconditions of the morality. We have to be able to make choices. We have to be able to act in furtherance of our own interest to maintain our lives. But you cannot say one person has a right and somebody else does. So you say everybody has this equal right. That's all I mean is that in this case, you have a moral claim to make your choices, to do what you think is best. But everybody else has that equal claim. So if you initiate force against them, you violate their right to do the same thing. And everybody has these rights. Ultimately, it redounds to the right to self defense. If you try to stop me from doing what I judge is in my best interest, I have a right to defend myself. Now, obviously, JimBob is correct. In the end, it doesn't matter if you have rights. If somebody's bigger, stronger, tougher, if a country has more weapons, they can violate your rights. That's obvious. But that does not negate the concept of right. What we need to do if we are to live in a just society is subordinate might to right. We need to put might on the side of defending rights rather than violating rights. Unfortunately, in the sorry history of humanity, with very few exceptions, most governments that get together violate rights. They don't protect them. With that, I'll end and I'll just say, hey, we're going to engage for a little while. That's great. And again, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. And Sarah, I may be reaching out to you in the future for future debates.